April 1945. Germany is collapsing. The Third Reich is dying in fire and rubble, its armies shattered, its generals scrambling to escape the noose tightening around them from every direction. And somewhere in the chaos of the Western Front, a 16-year-old American private named Jimmy Caldwell is lost, separated from his unit, hungry, exhausted, and carrying nothing but a rifle he barely knows how to use. He has been walking for hours. He has no idea where he is. And all he can think about is the smell drifting from a German farmhouse 100 yards ahead. Someone is cooking chicken. What happens next will become one of the most absurd, improbable, and strangely consequential moments of the entire war, because within the hour, this starving teenager from rural America will capture a German major general, a veteran of 2 world wars, a man who has commanded tens of thousands of soldiers across multiple fronts, and he will do it with a hot chicken. But this is not just a story about a ridiculous accident. It is a story about what war really looks like when the grand strategies collapse and all that remains is hunger, fear, confusion, and the terrifying comedy of human desperation. It is exactly the kind of story that gets buried beneath the famous battles and famous generals, the kind of story that reveals more about war than any official history ever could. And by the time it ends, the intelligence Jimmy Caldwell accidentally delivers will save hundreds of American lives. This is how a farm boy who had no business being in the Army changed the course of an entire offensive with nothing but his stomach and a stolen lunch. To understand how Jimmy Caldwell ended up alone in enemy territory, you have to understand what was happening in Germany in the spring of 1945. The war in Europe was entering its final, most chaotic phase. The Western Allies had crossed the Rhine. The Soviets were grinding toward Berlin from the east. The Wehrmacht was disintegrating, caught between 2 unstoppable forces, hemorrhaging men, equipment, and coherence by the day. Entire divisions were surrendering. Others were fighting to the death. Some were simply melting away into the forests and villages, hoping to disappear before the end came. For the American forces pushing into the German heartland, this meant something dangerous. The enemy was no longer predictable. One village might surrender without a shot. The next might contain fanatics willing to die for a lost cause. Pockets of resistance appeared and vanished. Supply lines stretched thin, units got separated, communication broke down. The neat lines on the maps meant less and less with every passing day. And into this chaos walked Jimmy Caldwell. He was 16 years old. He had lied about his age to enlist, adding 2 years to his birth date, convincing a recruiter who either did not care or did not look too closely. He came from a small farming community. He had never been outside the United States before the war. He had never fired a weapon at another human being, and now he was somewhere in Germany, alone, with no food, no map, no compass, and no idea whether the next person he met would be a surrendering soldier or a diehard willing to kill him on sight. He had gotten separated during a patrol. The details of exactly how this happened are murky, as they often are in the confusion of combat. What matters is that by the time Jimmy realized he was lost, it was too late to find his way back. He had walked in what he thought was the right direction. He had walked for hours, and now he was standing at the edge of a clearing, staring at a German farmhouse, and all he could smell was roasting chicken. His stomach made the decision before his brain could intervene. He approached the farmhouse carefully, rifle ready, heart pounding. He had no plan. He was not thinking about tactics or doctrine or the rules of engagement. He was thinking about food. He was thinking about the fact that he had not eaten in nearly 2 days. He was thinking that if he could just get inside, just grab something, just fill his stomach, he might have the strength to figure out what to do next. He reached the back door. He listened. He heard voices inside, but they were faint, coming from another room. He pushed the door open. He stepped into a kitchen. And there, sitting on a wooden table, was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, a whole roasted chicken, steam still rising from its golden skin. Jimmy did not hesitate. He grabbed the chicken with both hands. It was hot. It burned his fingers. He did not care. He turned to leave. And that was when the German officer walked in. The officer was an adjutant, a staff officer attached to a senior commander. He was not armed. He was not expecting to find an American soldier in the kitchen. For a long moment, the two men simply stared at each other, frozen in mutual disbelief. Then the adjutant shouted. Jimmy panicked. He did the only thing his body could think of in that instant. He threw the chicken. The hot, greasy, freshly roasted bird hit the German officer directly in the face. The man screamed, stumbled backward, clawing at his eyes, half blinded by the scalding fat. Jimmy fumbled for his rifle, his hands slick, his heart hammering so hard he could barely breathe. And then another man appeared in the doorway. This man was older, taller. His uniform was immaculate, covered in decorations. His bearing was unmistakably that of a senior officer. He took one look at the scene before him, his adjutant writhing on the floor, covered in chicken grease, a terrified American teenager pointing a rifle at him with shaking hands. And then, slowly, deliberately, Major General Heinrich von Schellenberg raised his hands. What Jimmy Caldwell did not know, could not possibly have known, was that the man standing in front of him was one of the most experienced officers in the German army. Heinrich von Schellenberg was a career soldier. He had served in the First World War. He had risen through the ranks during the interwar years. He had commanded troops on multiple fronts during the Second World War. By April 1945, he was in charge of the 416th Infantry Division, a formation that had been battered and depleted, but was still attempting to maintain some semblance of organized resistance. Von Schellenberg was not a fanatic. He was a professional, and professionals understood arithmetic. He understood that the war was lost. He understood that continued resistance meant only more death, more destruction, more suffering for men who had already given everything. He understood that the Americans were not the Soviets, that surrender to the Western Allies might mean survival, might mean a future. And now, standing in a farmhouse kitchen, watching his adjutant roll on the floor, screaming about his burned face, the general found himself facing a child who was clearly terrified, a child who was clearly lost, a child who had no idea what he had just stumbled into. Von Schellenberg could have tried to resist. He could have called for guards. He could have taken his chances. But what he saw in that moment was not a threat. It was an opportunity. An absurd, improbable, almost laughable opportunity to end this cleanly, to surrender to the Americans, to take his division out of the war before the Soviets arrived, before the fanatics in Berlin could issue more suicidal orders, before more of his men died for nothing. So he raised his hands and he began to speak. Jimmy Caldwell did not speak German. Von Schellenberg spoke only limited English, but the body language was unmistakable. The general was surrendering. He was pointing at himself, at the house, at something beyond the walls. He was trying to explain something. Jimmy had no idea what to do. He had captured a German officer, maybe a senior one, judging by the uniform, but he was still lost, still alone, still holding a rifle on two men in a kitchen that smelled like burned poultry and fear. He needed to get back to his unit. He needed to bring this man with him. He needed to not die in the next 10 minutes. He gestured with his rifle. "Get up, move." The adjutant staggered to his feet, still clutching his face. The general nodded, almost calm, almost as if he had been expecting this moment. The three of them walked out of the farmhouse together. the American teenager and his two German prisoners, into the April sunlight. What followed was a strange, tense, almost surreal march through the German countryside. Jimmy had no idea where he was going. He simply walked in what he hoped was the direction of American lines, prodding his prisoners forward, trying to look confident, trying not to show how terrified he was. Von Schellenberg walked with the dignity of a man who had made his decision and was at peace with it. The adjutant walked with the gait of someone who had just been assaulted with hot poultry and was still trying to process the experience. They walked for hours. They encountered German soldiers twice, small groups of stragglers who looked at the scene in confusion. Von Schellenberg spoke to them briefly, calmly, and they moved on. Later, Jimmy would understand that the general had been telling them to stand down, that the war was over for them, that resistance was pointless. At the time, Jimmy only knew that somehow, impossibly, he was still alive and still moving. By nightfall, they reached American lines. The reaction among Jimmy's comrades was disbelief. They had assumed he was dead. They had assumed he was captured. They had not assumed he would return with two German prisoners, one of them a major general in full dress uniform. Intelligence officers were summoned. Translators were brought in, and as the hours passed, the true magnitude of what Jimmy Caldwell had accidentally accomplished began to emerge. Heinrich von Schellenberg was not just a divisional commander. He was a man with detailed knowledge of German defensive positions, troop strengths, supply situations, and planned movements across a significant sector of the front. He was, in intelligence terms, a gold mine, and he was ready to talk. The general had made his decision. He was not interested in protecting secrets for a regime that had already lost. He was interested in ending the war, in saving what remained of his men, in perhaps salvaging something from the catastrophe. He provided American intelligence with detailed information about German positions, about where resistance would be strongest and where it would collapse, about supply depots, and command structures and the morale of the troops under his command. This information was immediately actionable. American commanders adjusted their plans. Attacks that might have walked into prepared defenses were rerouted. Strongpoints that might have cost hundreds of lives to crack were bypassed or neutralized with minimal casualties. The intelligence von Schellenberg provided accelerated the American advance through his sector by days, perhaps longer. And all of it happened because a 16-year-old farm boy got hungry and threw a chicken at someone's face. The story of Jimmy Caldwell spread quickly through the ranks. It was too good not to share. A kid, barely old enough to drive, capturing a German general with a roasted bird. It sounded like something from a comic book. It sounded like propaganda. It sounded impossible. But it was true. The reaction to Jimmy's exploit was complicated. On one hand, he was celebrated. He had captured a high-value prisoner. He had provided intelligence that saved lives. He was, in some sense, a hero. On the other hand, he was a 16-year-old who had lied about his age to enlist, who had gotten separated from his unit, who had wandered into enemy territory alone, and who had succeeded through what could only be described as blind luck and desperation. The army did not quite know what to do with him. There were conversations about sending him home. There were conversations about keeping him quiet. There were conversations about what kind of message his story sent about the state of American military discipline. In the end, the chaos of the war's final weeks swept all of these concerns aside. There were bigger things to worry about than one teenage private and his improbable chicken. Jimmy finished the war. He came home. He returned to a country that was celebrating victory, that was trying to move forward, that was not particularly interested in the strange, small, absurd stories that had happened in the margins of the grand narrative. He went back to farming. He lived a quiet life. For decades, his story remained mostly unknown outside of those who had been there, those who had heard the tale passed down through military folklore. It was too strange, too comic, too at odds with the serious, heroic image of the war that dominated public memory. It was easier to remember the famous battles, the famous generals, the famous speeches. It was harder to remember the chaos, the hunger, the fear, the moments when the great machinery of war was reduced to a boy, a bird, and a burned face. But the story survived. It survived because it was true, and because true stories have a way of persisting even when they do not fit the expected mold. What makes Jimmy Caldwell's story more than just an amusing anecdote is what it reveals about the nature of war itself. War is supposed to be about strategy, about logistics, about the clash of armies and the decisions of generals, and on one level, it is. The outcome of the Second World War was determined by industrial capacity, by strategic planning, by the mobilization of millions of men and the deployment of billions of dollars worth of equipment. But on another level, war is chaos. It is confusion. It is exhaustion and fear and hunger and the desperate improvisation of people who are just trying to survive the next hour. It is generals who surrender because a teenager threw lunch at their adjutant. It is intelligence coups that happen by accident. It is plans that collapse and opportunities that arise from the wreckage. Jimmy Caldwell should not have been in Germany. He was too young. He had lied to get there. He should not have been separated from his unit. He should not have been wandering alone in enemy territory. He should not have been thinking about food when he should have been thinking about survival. By any rational standard, he should have been dead. But he was not dead. He was alive. And because he was alive, and because he was hungry, and because he panicked and threw a chicken at a German officer, hundreds of other men lived who might otherwise have died. That is war. That is the reality that the clean histories and the heroic narratives cannot quite capture. The absurdity. The randomness. The way that fate turns on moments so small, so ridiculous, so utterly unpredictable that they seem like fiction. Heinrich von Schellenberg understood this. He had been a soldier for decades. He had seen enough war to know that it was not the thing the propaganda made it out to be. He had seen enough to know that sometimes the most consequential moments were the ones that made the least sense. When he raised his hands in that farmhouse kitchen, he was not surrendering to an army. He was surrendering to the absurdity of the situation, to the recognition that the war had reached a point where a starving child with a burned bird had become as significant as any strategic calculation. He survived the war. He survived captivity. He returned to Germany and lived out his remaining years in a country that had to rebuild itself from the ashes of its own catastrophe. What he thought about that moment in the kitchen, about the teenager who captured him, about the chicken that changed his fate, we do not know. He did not leave extensive memoirs. He did not become famous for his surrender. He became, like so many others, a footnote in a war that produced too many stories to count. But Jimmy Caldwell's story endured. It endured because it was human. It endured because it reminded people that behind the statistics, behind the maps, behind the grand strategies, there were individuals, there were moments, there were decisions made in fear and hunger and confusion that changed everything. There is a photograph that survives from April 1945. It shows a young American soldier standing next to a German officer in a battered farmyard. The soldier looks impossibly young. The officer looks exhausted, resigned, perhaps even faintly amused. Between them, in the dirt, lies the carcass of a chicken, stripped and cold, forgotten in the chaos of what came after. The photograph is not famous. It does not appear in the major histories. It is not displayed in museums. But for those who know its story, It captures something that the grand narratives miss. It captures the moment when the entire absurd machinery of the Second World War was reduced to its simplest elements: hunger, fear, chance, and the strange, unpredictable ways that human beings respond to impossible situations. Jimmy Caldwell lived a long life. He raised a family. He worked his land. He did not seek fame or recognition for what happened in Germany. When people asked him about the war, he sometimes told the story. He told it simply, without embellishment, often with a small shake of his head, as if he still could not quite believe it himself. A chicken, a general, a 16-year-old farm boy who should not have been there at all. That is how wars end. Not with grand speeches and signed surrenders, but with exhausted men making decisions in farmhouse kitchens, with hunger overwhelming caution, with accidents that become intelligence coups, with the collapse of order that reveals the chaos underneath. April 1945. Germany is collapsing. A starving teenager throws a chicken at a German officer's face. A major general raises his hands, and somewhere in the machinery of war, the gears shift in ways that no strategist could have predicted. Hundreds of men who would have died in the next week's fighting will go home instead. They will raise families. They will grow old. They will never know that they owe their lives to a boy who got lost and got hungry and did the only thing his panicked brain could think of in the moment. That is the story of Jimmy Caldwell, the 16-year-old farm boy who captured a German general with a chicken, the accidental hero who changed the course of an offensive without ever understanding what he had done. The reminder that war, for all its scale and horror and strategic complexity, ultimately comes down to individual human beings making decisions in moments of chaos. And sometimes, in the strangest and most unpredictable ways, those decisions matter more than anyone could ever imagine. If stories like this remind you why history is worth uncovering, why the forgotten moments deserve to be remembered, why the absurd and the human and the accidental are as much a part of war as the famous battles and famous names, then you understand what this channel is about. There are thousands of stories buried in the margins of history, stories of ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances, stories that reveal more about war than any textbook ever could, and we are here to find them, to tell them, to make sure they are not forgotten. Because somewhere in every war there is a 16-year-old who should not be there, a chicken that becomes a weapon, a general who raises his hands, in a moment that changes everything. Those are the stories worth remembering.